there. How you doing? This is Caleb Jones, and this is the Alpha Male 2.0 podcast, episode number 135. Holy crap. A lot of podcasts. How long have I been doing this? I don't even know. Long time. This is the podcast where we talk about maximum long-term masculine happiness through long-term masculine freedom in your financial life, in your sex life, in your overall logistical life, and every other aspect. And recently, I started doing something for fun on my brief off time, which I don't have very much of. But when I take brief little breaks throughout the day, something that I thought would be mildly enjoyable and mildly interesting, and instead turned into something that I really enjoyed a lot. And that is that I started watching movies and TV shows from the 80s, which is the era in which I grew up, that I had missed, that I missed out on, because I am an 80s culture aficionado, because that's the era in which I grew up. And so I watched everything, just about everything you can think of the 80s. Television and movies is a very big part of my life, and it's part of my life that, the only part of my life that I actually miss. Everything about my life is amazing. This is the best time of my life right now, is right now at age 50 in the year 2022. But there are little bits and pieces of the 80s that I miss. And I thought through this, and I went, there's a few shows, TV shows, and a few movies that I missed. And I should go back and watch those, because God knows I can't watch any movies now. As I've talked about on my blogs, I stopped watching movies as a regular thing in late 2017. Hollywood can't create good movies anymore. I mean, just look at the last set of Marvel movies. Marvel movies used to be fantastic, and now they've been awful for years. And certainly TV shows are terrible. My God, I couldn't even get through 6 minutes. I think I got through 6 minutes of that new Lord of the Rings TV show before I had to turn off in disgust, because the writing is so terrible. That She-Hulk TV show is just the latest in a string of terrible, terrible Marvel shows. On and on and on and on and on. So certainly I can't consume today's pop culture, because today's pop culture sucks. We are in a slowly collapsing society. So I decided to go back to the 80s when culture was strong and on the rise, when things were good. And boy, was I shocked as I watched these things in the 80s to experience these wonderful things that I remember experiencing in the 80s that I have completely forgotten about now that I live in a collapsing, dark, broken world. And in particular, there's a bunch of examples I could give you, but in particular, I am now watching a show that I missed in the 80s. I was aware of this show, but I missed it, and that is the show Airwolf. And if you are a youngster, you probably have no idea what the hell that is, or maybe you've heard of it. If you're my age or maybe a little older, you know exactly what Airwolf is. Airwolf was a show about a super high-tech badass helicopter that would go around and blow shit up. And the star of the show was Jan Michael Vincent, who actually coincidentally later became addicted to drugs and just completely imploded and died, which is interesting. But anyway, I watched all the famous shows of the 80s, He-Man and Transformers and G.I. Joe and Knight Rider. And I watched it, but for some reason I missed on Airwolf. I just didn't get around to that when I was a kid for some reason. So I said, I'm going to go back and watch that. And it'll be new because I've never seen it. I watched bits and pieces of it, but I've actually watched it through. And I'll watch a few episodes, and if I like it, I'll keep watching it, because that maybe it'll be good because it was made in the 80s, back when they made good shit. And boy, what an experience. Just in the first pilot episode, it's like a 2-hour pilot episode, there's all kinds of things, little moments. And I go, oh my God, that's right. That's so cool. I remember that. Oh, that's right. That's how things used to be. Isn't that great? Now, before I go on and talk about how much I love things that were from the 80s that don't exist anymore, I'm going to be very clear about this. I am not one of these traditional conservative, tradcon, right-wingish, Republicanish guys who think that everything was perfect back in the 1950s or 60s or 70s or 30s or whatever, and we should go back to that time. No, I am not in that camp, and I've talked about that many times in my blogs and videos. I am not a conservative. I am not a Trump supporter. I'm not a Republican. No, there's many aspects of the 80s I don't like, and I do not want to go back to the 80s. What I want is for modern day society to progress forward. Today it's going backwards, but I want to progress forward with some aspects that we had back in the 1980s, particularly around things like masculinity and happiness. People were a lot happier. Boy, are they a lot happier in the 80s. Americans in particular. Americans were happy in the 80s. Today, they're all miserable. It's one of the reasons I left America. So as I wax nostalgic about a few of these aspects that I saw from Airwolf and a bunch of other things, just realize I'm not one of these guys that says, boy, I wish we could go back to the 80s. I don't. I don't wish that. I just wish of aspects. I'll be more clear as I go on. Give you specific examples of things I saw just in the first episode of Airwolf. Now, I'm also not recommending you watch Airwolf. It is quite dated. Many of you won't like it. The pacing is very different than what you're probably accustomed to today. This is a show that was made, 40-ish years ago, 35 years ago. So I'm not recommending you watch it. I just enjoyed it because I lived through that era and I remember all these things. So for example, many examples. One is there are scenes in Airwolf where the alpha male lead character, and he has this silly, corny 80s name. His name is Stringfellow Hawk. Of course, that's very 80s. And they call him String for short. So he's this badass alpha, of course. But we had alpha male characters back in the 80s. I've written about this in my blogs. We had those, and they were normal. They weren't weird or funny back then. That was what men looked up to back then. And in the 80s, alpha male characters in pop culture had game. They actually had game. Today, most masculine, even masculine male leads in movies and TV shows have no game. Even if they're presented as a badass guy like James Bond or The Rock, they don't have game. They just don't. I'll give you a perfect example. So there's a scene in Airwolf where the alpha male lead character lives on this beautiful cabin out in the wilderness in the forest on a beautiful lake. Actually looks a lot like Oregon where I grew up. And his old boss from the CIA is visiting, and there's this cute girl with him, and they're trying to recruit him for a job. And they actually stay over and spend the night with him. And there's a scene in the evening where the woman is flirting with him or giving him a bunch of shit. And the alpha male character takes the woman and throws her down on the bed. I don't recommend that, but he throws her down on the bed. Remember, it was the 80s. He has no shirt on, right? And she's wearing kind of this nightie. And he gets on top of her and he gets right in her face and says a few things to her very quietly. And she's like, oh. And then he just, after talking very briefly, he just rolls off of her and leaves. That's game. That's what the pickup artist called push-pull. It is a very effective seduction technique that I have used myself with the more attractive women. You don't see male, even alpha male characters, what few there are, in today's movies and TV shows do anything like that. They have no game. They just don't. There was a famous scene in the pickup artist world in Top Gun, which was also around this same era, early to mid 1980s, where Tom Cruise is talking to Kelly McGillis, the cute girl in that movie, and I think they're in an elevator, and she's standing against a wall, and he leans up against her, puts a hand on the wall, and is right in her face and just talks to her kind of sultry and seductively like this. And she thinks he's about to kiss her, and then he moves in, and then he just leaves. And she's like, oh, which drives women crazy. And again, another example of how alpha male characters, masculine characters in pop culture back when I was a kid in the 80s, actually had game. They knew how to attract women. Today, most male characters in most TV shows, right, and movies are beta males who have no game. And what few men are portrayed as alpha males, like Vin Diesel type characters, The Rock type characters, they don't really have game. They're just good looking and they ride on their looks, and that's about it. You don't actually see them seduce any women. And I saw that scene in Airwolf. I went, oh yeah, that's right. Men in movies knew how women worked. And you could learn through osmosis through watching these characters. I mean, if you don't believe me, go back. This is not 80s, this is 60s. Watch Captain Kirk in the original Star Trek TV show. He had game. He was so charismatic. You just don't see that anymore. So there's another scene. It gets even better. So there's another scene. Again, this is the pilot episode of Airwolf. This is a good one. So, the lead CIA guy leaves. The Stringfellow Hawk agrees to the mission. So the woman stays, of course, so he can bang her. But the woman stays to start debriefing him, briefing him on the mission, right? And she says, well, I have to brief you on the upcoming mission. She has all these, photographs and charts and graphs and all this shit on paper in this little folder. And he says, well, I'm going fishing. And she's like, but I have to brief you on the mission. He's like, whatever, I'm going fishing. I'm not changing my schedule for you. She's like, ugh. So the very next scene is they're out on a rowboat on the lake, and he's sitting there fishing, and she's on the edge of the boat, and the boat's rocking around. She's like, oh. And right there, I went, oh yeah, in the 80s, it wasn't just men who were the irritating characters. It was also sometimes women who were the irritating characters. Sometimes in the 80s, and if you're a young guy, this blows you away, the man was the cool character, and the woman was the irritating character. Sometimes, not always. Sometimes it was the opposite. Today, it's 100%, almost 100%, 95%. The woman is the cool character, who has her shit together, is non-needy. And it's the man who's kind of irritating and annoying and needy, right? And I went, oh yeah. But the scene goes on. So she's sitting in the boat and she's rocking around the boat, right? And he's sitting there fishing, having a good old time. And she's starting to pull out all these dossiers and shit, trying to explain the mission. He's completely ignoring her because he's having a fun fishing. And he reels in a fish, this big, beautiful salmon or trout. Really pretty. He holds it up. He's all proud of it. He's like this. Like, yeah. And she goes, what a beautiful animal. He's so beautiful. And he kind of smiles like, yeah, I'm awesome. I know. And she goes, throw him back. And he goes, what? And she goes, throw him back. I mean, he's so beautiful. You're not going to hurt him. Look, he's beautiful. Could you please throw him back? And it's beautiful. He just looks at her. He turns and glares at her like, you fucking bitch. How dare you? But he doesn't say anything. The look says it all. He just looks at her and just glares at her. And she kind of looks away like, oh shit. And that's it. That's it. No dialogue. Again, do you see scenes like this? No. Now here's even better. The very next scene, hard cut. The very next scene is him at night at his dining room table eating the fish. He's like, this is a good fish. And she's on the other end of the table and she's all pissed off. She's like, you killed that fish. He was so beautiful and you killed him just because you wanted to eat him. And she literally starts to cry. And he's like, yeah, this tastes great. It's so good. And she's like, ooh, she starts crying. And he starts joking around. He's like, oh, so you only eat ugly animals, right? So like you eat pigs, right? She's like, yeah, I have bacon and you eat lamb. She goes, yeah, I like lamb. Cute little lambs. Cute little beautiful lambs. She's like, what? And she gets up and leaves the room. And he just keeps eating, smiling on his face. I'm like, this is so good. I remember this. And again, you don't see scenes anything like this today. And you haven't seen anything like this for at least, 15 years, maybe 20 years in pop culture. My God. So then there's another scene where this time it's the villain of the show. And he is in Libya. He has stolen Airwolf, right? And the mission is to get the Airwolf back from the villain. This bad guy is a villain from the UK, has a British accent. And he's in Libya. And if you didn't know, if you were not part of Gen X like me, one of the big bad guys in pop culture, kind of in the zeitgeist back in the early 80s, was Gaddafi. That was one of the big bad guys. There were a lot of video games you fought Libya and things like that back in the 80s. So, of course, Gaddafi is kind of this unseen bad guy in this episode. And so the villain is sitting there. He's from the UK. And next to him is the Libyan general who he's like working with. And they're at some kind of belly dancing thing. I mean, like almost a strip club. Now, this was on TV. They couldn't show nudity back then. So this chick is up there dancing. And she's also Western. She is from the United States. And she's hot, at least 80s hot. And he's checking her out like, oh yeah, she's hot. And the Libyan general turns to the villain and he says, I don't understand why you Westerners like women who look like that. I mean, she is so skinny. Look how skinny she is. If she was out in the desert for just 4 hours, she'd be dead. And it's funny, I relate to this because I live in the Middle East now. And the villain just smiles and turns the general and says, 4 hours with a woman like that, worth it. That's it. And again, I'm sitting there, I'm with a smile on my face like you would never see anything or rarely see anything like that, any scene like that, even coming out of a villain's mouth today. You wouldn't see it. See, back in the 80s, it was okay to verbally state that you liked fit, skinny, attractive women. That was okay. That wasn't fat shaming back then. It's so different now. And again, watching these scenes, like, oh my God, that's right, I remember this. No wonder people were happier in the 80s. Anyway, so then it gets better and better. So then there's a scene where String's old friend, he's an old man, played by Ernest Borgnine. If you are my age or older, you know who Ernest Borgnine is. If you're a young guy, you probably don't know what that is. He was a famous actor from the 50s and 60s. He started a lot of movies with Frank Sinatra and things like that. And by the 80s, he was an old man, kind of this chubby old guy. And he's like String's old man friend. So String is hanging out with the chick. He's already banged her, of course, because that happened a long time ago. And they're hanging out in the cabin, and the old man comes in, and he's bringing a bunch of groceries. He has kind of this box in his hands, 2 hands with a bunch of grocery bags. And he walks in the living room, and the woman runs up to him and says, oh, please, let me help you with that. And he goes, no, I don't believe in feminism, and just walks right past her. Now, to be clear, He doesn't say feminism. He says woman's lib because that's what people called feminism back then. It stand for women's liberation. In the 70s and 80s, it was about women's lib. But anyway, he goes, I don't believe in women's lib. He just walks right past her. She's like, oh. And he just walks in the kitchen and he goes, yeah, I believe that men and women should just play the roles that God intended. Very right-wing, traditional Republican, very old man. My grandpa was like this. And she's just like, what? She's all flustered, right? And Stringfellow Hawk, of course, is nearby. And he says, sweetie, you don't want to get in an argument with him about this because if you do, you're not going to like what he says. And the old man says, yeah, I admit that I'm old-fashioned, and he literally says this is his exact line. He goes, I admit that I'm old-fashioned, but that's my privilege. And the woman says, she looks at him and says, you know what? You're right. That is your privilege. And she just smiles and they just go on with their day and she helps him unpack the food and they're friends again. And I went, oh yeah, back in the 80s, you could have completely diametrically opposite political views and still be friends with people. A lot of you young people and some of you people who are my age don't even remember those days, you Americans, don't you? Do you remember the days, you guys are my age or older, do you remember the days maybe 15 plus years ago, 20 plus years ago, 80s, 90s, 70s, 60s, where you could be a hard right-winger and be perfectly good friends with a hard left-winger, or the other way around, you could be a hard left-wing socialist, feminist, what they call bleeding heart liberals back then, and be perfectly close with someone in your family or friends who is a hard right-wing Christian conservative, and it was perfectly fine. Do you remember those days? Weren't those days nice? Wasn't that nice? That's when America wasn't collapsing. People got along. And I watched this scene and I laughed for a minute thinking it was some kind of, this is how warped my brain has become. I laughed for a minute thinking that they were showing how dumb the woman was. How dumb is she to get along with this racist old man or whatever. But no, that's how it was in the 80s and the 90s and the 70s and the 60s. Prior to maybe George Bush's second term. That's how it was. That's how it used to be. On and on and on. Those are just 4 scenes off the top of my head from this 2-hour-long pilot episode of this TV show. And I'm a few episodes in. I'll probably complete the first season. My understanding is the second, third seasons get worse, which is typical TV shows. But anyway, I am sitting here watching this and I'm just floored at how much I forgot. And why America was on the rise in the 80s instead of on the way down. And why Americans were happy in the 80s instead of fucking furious. The difference was stark. And I was just so A, surprised, and B, happy. and I've said this before, I am very appreciative that I am the last generation, Generation X, the last generation of Westerners to grow up in a reasonably happy, burgeoning society. And there's also statements that have been made on the internet that I've repeated, and I think this is true, is Generation X, my generation, the generation that no one talks about. Everyone talks about boomers and millennials and Gen Z. No one talks about Gen X for some reason. So my generation, the one no one talks about, was the last generation who grew up, who actually enjoyed our childhoods. And I remember why, watching these 80s materials. And it's not just these moments that are reflective of pop culture and culture at large back in the 80s. But things like, for example, I watched a movie a little while ago, another movie that I had missed. I watched the last 15 minutes when I was a kid, but I missed the whole movie. And it's a movie called At Close Range, 1986, starring Christopher Walken and Sean Penn when he was a high schooler. And it's based on a true story. It's a pretty brutal movie. It's a kid who meets up with his estranged father, and his dad, Christopher Walken, is this murderer and a thief, and it gets pretty bad. It's based on a true story. Anyway, the first few minutes of this movie, and I'm talking here about the artistry that you don't get in movies anymore. The first 5 minutes of this movie is just a scene where you see Sean Penn driving into town in a pickup truck. And there's this music playing, and he's looking around on the streets, and he's just watching people go by in this small town. And that's it. And it shows the credits as this is going, and it's beautiful. I'm sitting there watching this saying, this is beautiful. This is art. I've never seen, or not never seen, it has been 15, 20 years since I've seen an opening for a movie like this that shows actual real artistry, and nothing happens. And I bet a lot of young people watching that now would go, this is boring. But it was It was art. There was talent involved in constructing that scene. And I'm watching the scene, I'm riveted. I'm like, this is good stuff. Movie hasn't even really started yet. Pretty good movie too. It's interesting to watch how Sean Penn, even though he was an extreme left-winger, he was really buffed up. He's actually a strong real-life alpha male. He's a left-wing alpha male. You can be a left-wing alpha male. But anyway, it's interesting. So what are the lessons that we can learn from this? I'm trying to give you a takeaway here instead of just me waxing philosophical about Airwolf. A few things. Number one, try, if you're an American, and I know it's hard, and it's probably impossible for most of you listening to this podcast, which is one of the many reasons I left the United States, try to not give a shit about what people's political views are. One of the beauties of living here in Dubai is that, for the most part, no one gives a shit about politics. It's so different here. No one cares. No one cares. They just don't give a shit about politics here. And so even if the topic comes up, and it rarely comes up, spoken to a lot of people here in Dubai, and rarely does politics come up. In the United States, it comes up every 10 seconds. But rarely does the topic come up. And even if it does come up, if people disagree, they don't care. They go, oh, okay. It's like the 80s here in that respect. People don't give a shit about it. And a lot of other countries don't give a shit about this. This is an American thing and possibly a Western European thing and a Canadian thing. The collapsing trifecta, not coincidentally, the United States, Canada, Europe. The collapsing trifecta. Try not to give a shit about that. Try not to judge people about that. It's fascinating. This is the diametric opposite to what I saw on Airwolf. I read some survey information a few weeks ago that said that historically, this is Americans now, historically, Americans were upset about the skin color of people, right? So I don't want to live next door to a person with a different skin color of mine. That was historically in the last several decades. Then briefly during the 80s, it shifted a little bit and it was religion. So back in the 80s, the right-wingers were in control. Some of that was good, some of that was very bad. For example, when you play Dungeons & Dragons today and you tell people to play Dungeons & Dragons, no one cares. Back in the 80s, when I played Dungeons & Dragons, people lost their shit. What? Why are you playing that? You're worshiping the devil? What are you doing? And it wasn't just one or two people, it was a lot of people. So that's the downside of having right-wingers run everything. A lot of people are under the impression that if right-wingers just ran the country, everything would be great. No, some things would be better, some things would be worse. Anyway, during the 80s, it was religion. So if you were an evangelical Christian back in the 80s, you didn't want to live next door to an atheist, right? And today, it has shifted where people don't care about either one of those things anymore, by and large, with exceptions. Religious people don't care if they live next door to atheists. People, including right-wing conservatives, do not care if they live next door to, people of different skin color or different nationalities. They don't care. But you know what they care more about that is now even worse than racism or religious differences? Is political differences. People now say, if you're a left-winger, I don't want to live next door to a Trumper. I don't want to do that. If you're a right-winger, I don't want to live next door to a socialist or a Bernie Sanders supporter or a feminist or a whatever. People are furious about that. And that's one of the many reasons why Americans are so unhappy. And they weren't like this in the 80s. Americans were happy back in the 80s. Not perfect. I'm not saying there were no unhappy people in the 80s. I mean, don't get me wrong about this. Again, I'm not looking at the 80s with rose-colored glasses. I'm just giving you the takeaways here. And the last thing is that it is okay. I know I'm preaching to the choir here to a large degree. It is okay to celebrate positive masculinity. It's okay. I do it. We did it in the 80s. Everything was fine. Women, you didn't see, here's the thing about this, and I've mentioned this before. You did not see women in the 80s complaining that these action movies were all starring these big, buff, roided out men. You didn't see women bitching and moaning about this. You didn't. Plus, in the 80s, you had some very good and very popular movies starring strong women. The Alien movies, Aliens, Terminator 2, lots of movies like this in the 80s are close to it. Terminator 2 was 1991. That's pretty much 80s. And it was fine. Men didn't care. No one gave a shit about this gender stuff back in the 80s. No one gave a fuck. And you shouldn't either. I don't care. As long as it's good, who cares? It's interesting to me how the people who are behind the She-Hulk TV show, God, what an awful show. But again, it's typical. It's this, most shows are awful. Are constantly saying, well, men don't like this show because it's starring a female superhero. But men love the first Wonder Woman movie. Men love that movie. So what's your excuse now? Interesting. So anyway, I don't know if this was at all illuminating to you. Maybe if you're a younger guy, maybe it was. Maybe if you're a guy my age, you can remember. And if you are a guy my age, you are welcome to dig up Airwolf somewhere on the internet or rent it or buy it if you want to watch it. I don't recommend you doing that, but it's just something I'm doing. And maybe as I delve down this rabbit hole of 80s pop culture that I missed out on, I might do other podcasts on this if you guys enjoyed this topic. I'm sometimes surprised the topics you guys enjoy. You really love the Conan podcast, so that's one of the reasons I decided to talk about this. But let me know if you want more podcasts like this. Otherwise, I have many other topics to discuss. And that's it. I will see you in the next podcast next week. Have fun. Bye.